Resuming debate, the honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise today in response to the Speaker's ruling regarding the Liberal government's refusal to comply with a binding House order to produce documents related to Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or better known to Canadians as the Liberal Green Slush Fund. It's like Groundhog Day here in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. We are once again debating another Liberal scandal instead of legislation. But the Liberals have done this to themselves. They're clearly trying to hide the details of yet more corruption. And I have a prediction for you. These documents will eventually prove that the Liberals have wasted taxpayer money and helped their friends. Because why else would they go to such great lengths to keep them so secret? It's simply astounding and frankly infuriating to myself and to the people that I represent that this Liberal government has become so complacent and so careless that they are willing to let millions of tax dollars be wasted and don't even want an investigation into how or why. Now, we're not just talking about numbers on a balance sheet here. We're talking about the hard-earned tax dollars of everyday Canadians, and it's reasonable for them to loathe waste and corruption that they've seen under this Liberal government. The sheer audacity of this Prime Minister to sidestep a binding House order and to cloak himself in secrecy is nothing short of outrageous, Mr. Speaker. But make no mistake, his stonewalling is not just irresponsible, it is a betrayal of the trust of the very people that he and everyone in this place was elected to serve. We owe it to Canadians to demand answers, to hold that Prime Minister accountable, and to ensure that taxpayer money is not being funneled into the hands of his friends, Liberal insiders. And to demonstrate why we must find the Liberal government in breach of our parliamentary privilege, by ignoring the will of this House, we must examine the pattern of appalling evasion and secrecy habits from this government. Now, as a bit of a refresher on previous Liberal failures to be open and transparent, beyond the matter before us, of course, let us not forget the SNC-Lavalin scandal. This is, of course, when the Prime Minister decided to fire Jody Wilson-Raybould for refusing to go along with his nefarious plan to change the law to protect himself and, of course, his friends. The Prime Minister was then repeatedly asked to waive cabinet confidence to let Ms. Wilson-Raybould speak, and he refused, time and time again. He did everything he could to make sure that no one, including and especially the RCMP, could even get access to evidence to properly investigate the matter. Now, let's fast forward to the Winnipeg lab documents that the Prime Minister refused to hand over, once again defying the will of Parliament in the process. When the previous Speaker ruled that he must and his government must hand over the documents, he said, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "The powers in question, like all those enjoyed by the House collectively and by members individually, are essential to the performance of their duties. The House has the power, indeed the duty, to reaffirm them when obstruction or interference impedes with its deliberations." Continuing on, I quote, "As guardian of these rights and privileges, that is precisely what the House has asked me to do today, by ordering the Speaker to reprimand you for the Public Health Agency of Canada's contempt, refusing to submit the required documents." This all sounds a little familiar to today's debate, of course. So what did the Prime Minister do in that instance? He was callous enough to let the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada take the fall. It was cruel that he decided to make a public servant take the fall for his failures of leadership and his own political objectives. Now, a long time ago, feels like forever, 9 long, miserable years ago or so, this Liberal Prime Minister promised that government would be open by default. I don't know if the Prime Minister believed himself then or if he just drank too much of their own Kool-Aid, but his record doesn't match that empty rhetoric. You see, Mr. Speaker, in politics, we should not be judged by our words. We should be measured against our actions. Words are cheap. Without following through, they aren't worth anything. Now, I don't blame Canadians for being upset at this Prime Minister, not just for this scandal, but broadly speaking, because he is anything but open and transparent. And the fact that we are here debating this again today is just yet another proof point of that. But the reason why this motion is so important is that it transcends mere procedural oversight. It speaks directly to the integrity of our democracy and the accountability that we owe to the people that each one of us represents in this place. This issue is not just about a handful of documents. It reflects a broader principle of good government, one that is essential for maintaining public trust, something that this Prime Minister has lost some time ago. So let us revisit the timeline and the facts that have brought us here today. On June 10th, this House passed a motion demanding specific documents that are critical to our oversight of government operations. We set a reasonable deadline, 30 days, to comply. Yet what followed would be far from satisfactory and in fact extremely disappointing, but perhaps not surprising given the track record. The reports submitted to the Speaker by the law clerk indicate partial disclosures and numerous redactions. And in some cases, we face outright refusals from various government departments. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is not merely a technical breach. It constitutes a dismissal of Parliament's authority. The actions of the Liberal government convey a troubling message that they simply prioritize convenience over accountability. This is not how government is meant to function. So let's take a moment to reflect on the importance of parliamentary privilege. The Speaker has in the past noted the absolute nature of powers to order the production of documents. Now, this is no trivial matter, Mr. Speaker. It is a cornerstone of our democratic process. Parliamentary privilege allows us to demand transparency, ensuring that the government is held accountable to the people that it serves, or at least should serve. This House has the unequivocal right to request any information necessary for us to fulfill those parliamentary duties. The Prime Minister must recognize that he is not above the rules. He's not above the rules that govern this place because it operates under the scrutiny of this House and, by extension, the very people of Canada that we are here to represent. Now, to stress that point, let us reflect on some historical precedents. Speaker Milliken has affirmed the House's unwavering right to order the production of documents, asserting that no exceptions should be made for any category of government documents. This principle is enshrined in our procedural traditions and underscores the fundamental duty of Parliament to oversee the actions of the government of the day. Now, as for why we are taking this somewhat extraordinary step, is because what we uncovered regarding this green slush fund scandal is nothing short of appalling. It directly undermines the fundamental tenet of responsible governance, that taxpayers should be directed towards their intended purposes, and even better yet, they should achieve outcomes of those purposes. Now, we discovered that the Liberals appointed a board of directors with individuals closely aligned with Liberal interests and deep-seated conflicts of interest. This board then made decisions that funneled taxpayer money to companies that, as the Auditor General pointed out, have no verifiable environmental benefits, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal government has tried to spin a yarn about how this is using tax dollars on green projects, yet instead it was mired with conflicts of interest and ineligible product applications. I do want to extend my sincere gratitude to my many hardworking Conservative colleagues, particularly the member for South Shore St. Margaret's, who have dedicated countless hours to get to the bottom of this, to find the truth. He and they have done exemplary work on behalf of Canadians by digging deep to get to the bottom of this mess. He exposed this green slush fund for what it truly was, a mechanism for companies to cash in for projects that weren't even eligible, or simply just to enrich themselves. And I'm particularly troubled by the notion of the board of directors allocating taxpayer money to companies in which they have a vested interest. This is a profound betrayal of the public trust. This is why this production order is so critical and why the government's defiance of such a serious breach of parliamentary privilege is so appalling. In my view, it is imperative that every member of this House, if they hold any belief, any desire to see accountability, must support this motion. Now, for those watching at home, Let me give you a rundown of how we got here, though. Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC, was not always this body engulfed in scandal and corruption. In fact, it started back in 2001 with the purpose of funding companies that create technologies promoting sustainable development. Not a bad idea, Mr. Speaker. And in its intended form, SDTC is an arm's-length and not-for-profit organization. However, it all changed with this Liberal government because they transformed it into anything but that. You see, SDTC has a board of directors who oversees payments from the fund. Jim Balsillie, the former CEO of BlackBerry, became the chair of this board back in 2013 and served in that capacity for several years. That is, until one day, the then Liberal industry minister expressed concerns because Balsillie was critical of his government. So they did what Liberals do. They searched for a friendly face to take on the role, ultimately settling on Annette Verschuren in June of 2019. And that's when the problems really started, Mr. Speaker. Ms. Verschuren had received SDTC funding, which made her the only chair in the fund's history to have interest in a company receiving money from that organization. The minister, the Prime Minister's office, and the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's bureaucratic department, were warned of the risks with her appointment, and yet they went ahead anyways. Ms. Verschuren then went on to normalize an environment where conflicts of interest thrived. Simply put, board directors would award funding to companies in which they held financial interests themselves. They enriched themselves at the expense of Canadians, of hardworking, tax-paying Canadians. The examples are incredibly damning, so let me just mention a few of them, though. Stephen Kukucha, a former Liberal political staffer, served as a director for some time. And during his tenure, companies in which he had a financial interest in received nearly $5 million in SDTC funding. Guy Ouimet, another director, admitted that companies he had a financial interest in received about $17 million in SDTC funding. Now, these numbers aren't exactly chump change, but they pale in comparison to the story of André-Lee Mathot. Ms. Mathot owns Cycle Capital, a firm that apparently invests in green technologies. During her time on the board, Mr. Speaker, $114 million in SDTC grants were given to companies that she had a financial interest in. And that was just during the time that she was on the board. When combining the companies that she'd invested in, receiving both before and after and during, $250 million that she was the benefactor of. And I'd like to say it stops there, but it actually gets a little worse, Mr. Speaker. Before he was focused on driving our economy into the ground, this radical Minister of Environment was a so-called strategic advisor for none other than Cycle Capital. Now, during his 10 years there, millions went from Liberal coffers to that firm. In fact, he still owns shares in that company, I understand, but refuses to tell us by how much they have increased. Now, my theory is they've increased a lot, Mr. Speaker, because he's apparently rich enough to not worry about the economic vandalism that he and his government are causing to Canadians. He must be buffered from those challenges. Now, regardless, the corruption here, it was too great. The gravy train had to end at some point. So in late 2022, whistleblowers raised concerns about the corruption at SDTC. And later in 2023, they went public with those concerns, sounding the alarm about the unethical practices of the organization. That November, the Auditor General announced that an audit of SDTC would be completed. The report released in June of 2024 was damning, to say the least. The Auditor General found 186 conflicts of interest. Not one, not two, not a few, 186. Who in their right mind thinks that this is acceptable? I don't care what your political stripe is. Nobody finds that acceptable, and to fight back against any investigation into that is simply appalling. Now, of the sample contracts investigated by the Auditor General, turns out there was $390 million in contracts inappropriately awarded. For many years, it was a good time to be a Liberal insider until these dastardly whistleblowers emerged. But it turns out, time's up. The most damning testimony, I think, came from these whistleblowers. So let me read a few quotes Mr. Speaker. One reads, quote, "The current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare. They would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like SDTC in the public sphere." And another quote reads, "The true failure of the situation stands at the feet of our current Liberal government, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up their findings over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic system and institutions are being corrupted by political interference." Mr. Speaker, I pause to give everyone a chance to reflect on those statements. If that doesn't drive home the problem here, I don't know what will. Now, recognizing this, the House decided to pass a motion on June 10th that called on the Liberal government to provide to this House documents pertaining to SDTC. It included provisions for the documents to then be provided to the RCMP so they could undertake a criminal investigation whether criminal offences were committed. And that last piece is important, since the Auditor General conducted a governance audit, not a criminal investigation. And what did the government do in response, you might ask? Reasonable question. Not what they were supposed to do, of course. They delayed and deflected so long that they forced the Speaker of this House to rule the government violated the privilege of the institution and its members. And that, my friends, simply put, is the story on how the Liberals transformed an arm's-length, not-for-profit organization into a money grab for Liberal insiders. Now, we all know the saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The Prime Minister used to crow about this all the time, but as of late, I wouldn't dare him to say it publicly because it wouldn't be taken seriously. Now, with many of the Prime Minister's promises, this is one that, of course, has faded off into the distance. It has taken immense effort from a parliamentary committee and now a production order from this House of Commons for the government to comply with our request for basic documentation about these payments. This should have been a straightforward process. These documents do not require a motion to obtain. Departments ought to proactively disclose such information, or at least readily provide it upon request. A government intent on transparency would have no qualms about sharing this information. But that's not this Liberal government. Consider this. The government has consumed valuable legislative time, forcing us to extract information that it just could have disclosed at the outset. Instead of coming forward with the necessary documentation when initial concerns arose, they chose to conceal it intentionally, wasting time and resources that could have been better spent in the eyes of, I think, every Canadian. The ongoing redactions and the refusal to release certain documents speaks volumes about the abilities of this government. These are not the actions of a government with nothing to hide. We're merely asking the government to hand these documents over to the law clerk, who can then forward to the RCMP if necessary. If, as we suspect, wrongdoing and illegality occurred, we owe it to the Canadian taxpayers who have seen their money wasted to pursue the truth. I fully support the proposal to refer this matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. This committee can delve deeper and examine what documents remain outstanding, what has been withheld, and crucially, hold those accountable for any misappropriated tax dollars. I urge all members to support this course of action because we need to send a strong message to this Liberal government. We will not be intimidated by your underhanded tactics or your secrecy. And I can tell you that I am not daunted or apprehensive about taking these Liberals on. This is exactly what I am doing at our Environment Committee right now as we start the process of investigating the Liberals' Net Zero Accelerator Fund, which is worth $8 billion, far more than this green slush fund that we're talking today. Now, our Environment Committee has passed numerous motions to get our hands on the contracts the Liberals signed, and we will do whatever is necessary to get to the bottom of that quagmire. And based on the Liberals' track record, I wouldn't be surprised if we see ourselves back here for a failure to deliver those contracts. Now, Mr. Speaker, with that, let me finish by saying it is vital that we remember who, as members of Parliament, we serve. Each of us has a duty to our constituents to ensure that the government is spending their hard-earned money appropriately, that it isn't being wasteful or misspent, that it's going towards its intended purpose and not to the pockets of Liberal insiders and those who simply know how to game the system. This is more than just documents. This is about accountability and our democracy. And those who do wrong must be brought to justice. I encourage all members, particularly my Liberal colleagues, who I know this will be rather difficult for, to stand up for what is right, because your colleagues, or your voters, elected you all for the same reason that mine elected mine. They want you to do the right thing. They want you to vote for this motion, provide a little bit of disinfectant, a little bit of sunlight to this information, When it matters most, it's time to stand up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.